you along the path towards creating a more sustainable landscape. So what do we mean by sustainable? First of all, it just requires a change in your perspective. Heidi Highland is a horticulturist in Corcoran, Minnesota. She owns Heidi's Grow House and Lifestyle Gardens. It's a garden. You can buy garden plants there. You can buy garden tools. She also does garden design. And she looks at it as a way to live lightly on the land. And I think that's a really good definition. Where do you begin? You start small. It doesn't have to be the whole landscape. So here's a couple of things that Heidi does. I borrowed some of her thoughts on this to start our discussion. So here's Heidi in her front yard. Believe it or not, she's holding a bean pod there in her hand. And this big tall plant behind her on the right is a trellis covered with bean vines. And she believes in interplanting edibles in her garden because edible gardening is sustainability. By growing and eating a little more of our own food, we're reducing the carbon emissions of all the trucks, for example, that transport food to the grocery stores, and all the resources that are used to grow food commercially and so on. So interplanting edibles is a great thing to do. And here you see Heidi, she's doing a little bit of deadheading, I think, and there along this garden bed are strawberry plants, and she's used them as a border for her garden plants. That's how she's interplanted edibles into her landscape. One of the many ways she's done that. She does a lot of vertical gardening. So this is Malabar spinach on a trellis. The spinach also produces these little pods, these little thin, little delicate purple pods that you can saute up when they're young and eat them. And you can also eat the flowers, apparently. She has another arbor in her yard that grows both grapes and cucumbers together. So the cucumbers climb up early in the season and they bloom and fruit. She harvests the cucumbers and the grapes follow, and then those grapes mature later in the summer, early in the fall. So she's making her garden space more efficient so she doesn't have to spread the resources so far. That's one way she does it. She uses a method called chop and drop, which is basically composting right where you're standing. It's a lazy way to compost. So when you're pulling up weeds or deadheading, instead of hauling that all to her compost pile at the back of her property, Heidi uses this chop and drop method. She cuts the plant back and she leaves all the biomass in the planting bed to decompose to benefit the plants directly and those soils that are right there. She also uses something called companion planting, and I'm going to give you an example of that. Something called a guild, that's a permaculture term, and it starts with several plants, 3 plants typically is in a guild, and here we have a pear tree. And these other plants that are planted with it are going to benefit this pear tree. So the blue false indigo, for example, is a member of the legume family, which fixes nitrogen in the soil for the pear tree, adds nitrogen to the soil. And comfrey is a member of vigorously growing perennial herb. It has a very long, thick taproot that draws up nutrients that are way down in the soil, like potassium and calcium and magnesium. And she uses comfrey here. She'll cut off the leaves and just scatter them about the base of the tree. You can also chop up the leaves and put it around the base of the tree to add all those nutrients. It's like a nutrient-rich mulch to improve the soil and support the growth of the other plants. So guild planting, where you're planting, intentionally putting plants together that are going to help each other. And then this is just another shot of edible gardening. She's got this beautiful purple kale in her front yard. It looks like a decorative plant, but it's a really fun thing to do. Couple other things that Heidi does. She uses drought tolerant plants, so she doesn't have to water as much. She uses woodies, what she calls woodies. Those are perennials and shrubs with woody stems that require less water and attention than your regular garden plants. And she also very much stresses stormwater management. So let's talk a little bit about water conservation. Fred Razumalski, who's a Twin Cities landscape architect, ecologist, he's done a lot of public garden installations, for example, along the river, downtown Minneapolis. He's done planned a lot of those plants at home. He has a sustainable, what he calls a sustainable shade garden. And in that garden, he says he won't have a plant that requires a lot of water because he's not going to water it and he won't plant it. So making intentional plant choices. Are you going to put in a plant that requires lots of water and lots of fertilizer? We have a choice when we're purchasing our plants. Here's a water conservation technique you can try to use. You can make a swale in your yard. So a swale is a dip or a ditch or a trench which slows and stores and spreads water. So here's a garden bed. You can see they've got strawberries there. They've lined their garden bed with strawberry plants. And then they have some other flowers mixed in here. And this is a ditch that was created, probably 6 to 12 inches deep. It can be as deep as 18 inches deep. It's a foot or two wide. And then it's filled with gravel or wood chip mulch, which you can use as a path. But the water is going to flow downhill and it's going to flow into this ditch and it's going to keep the water on the land. It's going to keep the water near these plants. So here's a little diagram that kind of shows you that the water flowing off the land, and here's the swale, and it goes down in here and soaks down, and it soaks underneath and feeds the roots of these plants. So it's a way to keep the water on the land so you don't have to water as much. It directs water to the swales, but by the way it's designed. And it's just a great technique of water retention, water conservation in your own yard. A little simple thing you can do. You should also be looking at how stormwater flows on your yard and garden. Are you taking advantage of that water? Or is it just flowing off onto your sidewalk or your driveway and off to the street and down the storm sewer? You can use permeable pavers in your front walk or your driveway instead of materials like concrete, impermeable surfaces like that. Keep the water in your yard. Another thing you can do, we've heard a lot about rain gardens, and there's lots of information through the University of Minnesota Extension, other places, and nurseries, gardens and nurseries. They're all equipped to help you build your own rain garden to retain that water on site. If you have a sprinkler system, don't rely on the even odd day system that a lot of cities try to keep their residents to. Our lawns only need an inch of water on average a week. So if it's rained that week, maybe you don't need to water as much. Use moisture sensors in your sprinkler system. And those moisture sensors, if you have a smart system, will turn off your sprinklers, or sprinkler system. So if it has been raining or it is raining, how many times have we driven down the street and you see a sprinkler system going while it's pouring with rain? So this is a smart way to water with a automatic watering system. Use drip irrigation whenever possible so that you can get the water directly to the roots of the plants. All good ways to conserve water. Sustainable gardening is also about using less peat. This is a photo that I stole off the internet of peat in a field in Ireland. The United Kingdom has quite a bit of peat, so does Northern Europe. Russia has a lot, Canada has a lot. And this is where it's been harvested out of these peatlands. They make these bricks, and here are stacks of it all along the ground. So why should we go peat-free? Well, peat is used by gardeners and the horticulture industry to improve water retention in the pots that you buy, in the nursery pots that you buy, so that they don't have to water as much. It aerates the soil and helps hold nutrients in those containers that we're purchasing. Peat is often used to acidify soil for growing blueberries or azaleas. They use peat pellets for starting seeds and peat pots. And by the way, sphagnum moss is not the same as peat. That's what this is. It's often used as a liner for hanging baskets. And sphagnum moss actually grows, it's a plant that grows on the top of these wetlands. And it's not a precious resource in the same way that peat is. So peat is formed over thousands of years by partly decomposed wetland plants. And it's compacted at a rate of 1/1/16 of an inch per year. If you think of that. In our lifetime, there's not enough peat created to keep up with the demand for peat in our horticulture industry. The peatlands also store significant amounts of carbon, and by taking it up and harvesting that peat, carbon's released to the atmosphere, speeds up global warming and climate change. Peat plays an important role in water quality and quantity. These peatlands are also a unique habitat for rare plants and animals. Virtually all the peat moss that we have here in the US, it comes from Canada. These are sphagnum moss bogs, so that, again, that's that plant that grows on top, and the peat is down underneath that sphagnum moss in Canada. So here are a couple photos that I took in Scotland on a trip I did in 2018 in the Isle of Skye, and this beautiful, gorgeous landscape here. And they had been harvesting peat. So you see these lines on the ground. That's where they've cut away the peat from the soil. So this is happening all the time. In the United Kingdom, they've been talking about it actually for quite some time now, probably at least a decade or more. And the government there wants to stop the use of peat in horticulture by professional growers by 2030. And they've asked amateur gardeners like us, to stop using peat as of last year. Right now, the Royal Horticulture Society cut its peat's use by 97%. So they've made great strides there. So what are alternatives to peat for us if we want to garden? You can make your own compost at home. That doesn't have any peat in it. If you look at the bag of compost that you're purchasing from the garden nursery or Home Depot or wherever you're getting it, often it contains peat. It's not necessary to have peat. There are other alternatives such as coconut coir, which is a coconut husk fiber that comes from Asia. There's lots of it there, and that holds 10 times its weight in water. It's very good at retaining water the same way that peat is. You can look for peat-free soil products that include compost, pine bark, perlite, vermiculite. There are other options, and you can mix your own peat-free potting soil at home. And you want to use a different kind of soil for when you put containers around your front steps or on your patio, because garden soil is too heavy. You need a little bit lighter soil, so you can make up your own peat-free potting soil. It's not hard to do. I've done it all the time. I do it all the time, actually. I just take a wheelbarrow and I mix up perlite, a little bit of vermiculite, and garden soil, and I make my own potting soil. This is a garden in the US, a famous garden in Pennsylvania called Longwood Gardens. There are gardens here that are taking steps to reduce or eliminate peat from what they're doing on those gardens. So it is being talked about here in the United States, but not to the extent that it is in the United Kingdom. This, by the way, this Cosmo, this is a compost that I've used several times, and it comes from Wisconsin. And it's cow manure and cow manure byproducts from cleaning out the barns and so on. And they mix in sawdust from a nearby furniture manufacturer to create this compost, organic compost. And you can find this at various places around the Twin City if you just look up Cosmo. Let's talk about lawns. And I'd like you to, if you do anything, to consider shrinking your lawn in size. So often there's a part of your lawn you hate to mow, and it's always a pain to mow it. Why not plant some shrubs there and stop mowing? The American lawn is our biggest crop. It accounts for 40 million acres, or 2% of the United States, has some kind of lawn on it. Americans spend $30 billion annually to fertilize and water that crop. So I try to encourage people to have instead what I call an intentional lawn. So here's Fred Rozumalski, the landscape architect I quoted. Here's his lawn. He's got his little green space, and then he framed it with these little walls, and he's got a path going down here so it doesn't look too messy. And the rest of it is plants. And here's my lawn in the backyard. Actually, there's a little less of it than this picture now. I've added more plants. And you know, we all need a little bit of lawn, maybe for kids, for dogs, and that kind of thing, but we don't need probably as much as we have currently. So the idea is to create a smaller, more intentional lawn, like an area rug in your home. And any area of diverse plantings requires fewer resources than most lawns. Fine fescue grass blends are great for lawn. If you're going to seed your lawn, use a fine fescue grass blend. It requires up to 30% less water than something like Kentucky bluegrass. It doesn't require as much fertilizer, and it's less mowing. It's a win-win-win all the way through. Let's talk about plastic. The amount of plastic that we have when we garden is just amazing. Can we garden guilt-free without plastic? It's a shame that plants, they're so natural and beneficial. They come in materials like this that are harmful to the environment. But if you want a lush garden, these kinds of pots are hard to avoid. So, but there are ways to repurpose, recycle plant containers so you can still satisfy your green thumb, have a garden too. So the problem with pots is that black plastic has no market. It's a mix of plastic that's been dyed. It's usually a petroleum-based plastic. So things like plastic pots, terracotta, ceramic, cement pots, they're not biodegradable. Every year in the United States, 4 billion container plant units are produced by the container crop industry. There are lots of plastic pots out there because they're considered durable, functional. They come in a variety of sizes. They're cheap to make. We know that a third of our metro area's waste was landfilled in 2019. Our goal was 2% for that landfill waste to be met by 2020. We didn't make it. So the counties in the metro area are advocating for change to hold these producers responsible, and they're hoping that consumers like us, gardeners like us, will too, and that when you go into the nursery, you're going to be asking for biodegradable pots. That's one of the things we can do as consumers. There are places that do recycle plastic pots. We know in Minneapolis we can't put them out on the curbside. They won't pick them up. So you can take them to any Home Depot or Lowe's. They, since 2009, Home Depot started a recycling program for plastic plant containers, and they actually reuse the pots that hold those flowers, plants, bushes, and trees. And then once they become unusable, they have a partner company called East Jordan Plastics that turns them into new pots, trays, and hanging baskets. And you don't have to have purchased the plant at Home Depot. They'll still recycle it. Same thing with Lowe's. Lowe's also accepts clean, empty mulch bags, which is great because often you can have a lot of those bags hanging out around. Otten Brothers takes 1 gallon larger containers if purchased at their store. Bachman's does not recycle pots. They used to at one time, but they said there was no market for that, so they stopped gathering them. But if we keep asking for this, for them to recycle, keep asking for biodegradable containers, we can make a difference that way. You can repurpose your pots. That's one way to get around it. You can reuse your plastic pots. I reuse mine all the time. You can use pieces of broken pots in the bottom of new ones to promote better drainage, or on top of the soil to discourage animals from digging in your plants. You can scatter around little shards of terracotta pots. This photo I thought was just darling. It's a mini fairy garden that somebody made out of a broken pot and on top of another pot. So there are things you can do if you're creative. You can make a spill pot. I think you might have seen those on the ground in people's gardens. They take like a pot that's been broken in half by frost and they stick it in the soil, and then they have the flowers growing out of it. It's kind of a cute idea. There are companies that are trying to close the recycling loop. And I just read about this company yesterday, and I wanted to share this with you because I thought this was so cool. I bought a pot from them because I thought it was so cool. This company is called Ocean Plastic Pots, and they're made from discarded rope and fishing net. This company is in Scotland. It was started by a commercial diver named Ali Mitchell. There are 8 million tons of plastic that enters our oceans every year. In December of 2019, a whale washed up on the Isle of Harris in Scotland, and it had 100 kilograms of rope, fishing net, and plastic debris inside of its stomach. It made international news. This diver, Ali, saw that and was so motivated to do something about it that he started making pots out of the old nets and the rope at home, in his home in Glasgow. Started selling them in the market. They were in huge demand. He teamed up with a manufacturer in Scotland, and then in December of 2020, they started making the pots and offering them for sale online. So you can see the pots come in the colors of the rope. They don't add dye to them. It comes from the raw material. So they have turquoise and mint green pots that look like all of these ropes. And as Ali says, here's his quote: "This is a small part, but I really believe we all have a responsibility to reduce the amount of plastic we use on a daily basis." Here's another kind of pot that you could buy here in the US. It's made in Belgium. They're called eco pots. You can find all kinds of products like this if you just make the effort to look for it. This one's made of 80% recycled plastic and 20% recycled natural stone. They're beautiful, very modern, minimalist looking pots. So that's another way to close the recycling loop. So there are some green alternatives. You can buy plants in biodegradable containers. Now, currently, if you go into the store and look for these, you're going to see peat pots. so you know what I think about peat pots. But this is a pot that I bought that's made, I think it's recycled paper. Pots made out of coconut husk fibers, rice hulls, wheat starch, bamboo, straw. There are pots that are currently being made about it. And growers are reluctant to use these because they're worried that the pot's not going to last through the nursery production cycle. They're reluctant to switch from plastic because, as I said, plastic pots are durable, they're cheap, they're functional, they come in all these sizes. So there's studies have been done about what's it going to take for growers to make this change. It's going to mean us asking for those kinds of containers. They need to be educated more about these pots and how they can make it through the nursery production cycle. You can make your own seedling paper pots. So here's a toilet paper roll, and I can cover this up with newspaper, and I can make this into a seedling pot. So if I'm going to start seeds, my tomato seeds, vegetable seeds, flower seeds, in the spring, I can use my toilet paper rolls or paper towel rolls or anything like that. Very simple technique. You can make your own soil blocks. So a soil block is this metal mold you see here. And there are very large ones too. You can buy them on the internet. You don't need a pot for this. And they're compressed cubes of the seed starting soil that's made in the press. And it's a recipe that you can use. It's a mix of compost and garden soil and so on. And on the handout, I'll be giving you a recipe for a soil block mix. And you can purchase a soil block mix as well. But you can see the plants grow up, and then you just plant the whole chunk right into the ground. It's super efficient. You can also consider buying something bare root. There are some things that are automatically available bare root. That's rhubarb. You can buy rhubarb bare root. You can order, when you order plants online, a lot of times those plants do come bare root. Asparagus is bare root. Roses are bare root. Trees and shrubs can be sold bare root. They're easy to plant. The trees are easy to plant. They don't require staking. And here is Jim Nays, who's the forester for Sunfish Lake City. That's, you don't know where that is. It's in the southeastern corner of the metro area. And he raises all of the trees that are used in the city bare root. So this is gravel, and there's no soil here, and the roots are down there in the soil, and these trees grow. So here's what a bare root tree looks like. Looks a little bit broader than if you bought one that was in a burlap ball or a container. And here's a 10-year-old tree. And I have to tell you, a 5-year-old can carry this tree because there's no soil attached to the tree at all. So they're super easy to plant. They're very light and they're healthy. So studies have shown that if you plant something bare root like this, the first year or two, they're probably about neck and neck with the health of one that might come in a pot or a burlap ball. But after that, these trees are shown to do better, be healthier in the landscape because they've been allowed to grow their roots out the way nature intended. Finally, let's talk a little bit about things you can do to design the way you add plants to your garden. You can be more sustainable about some of the choices that you're making. So you decide, I'm going to use as fewer annuals as I can, because if I bring in annuals year after year, I'm bringing in plastic pots to my house, and you might decide to use the annuals in a more strategic way to add color to your garden. So at the bottom here, you see I've quoted Jeff Epping. He's a horticulture director at Olbrich Botanical Gardens in Madison, Wisconsin. I highly recommend it if you've never been there. Gorgeous garden, one of the most beautiful gardens in the Midwest in my mind. And these are techniques that they use at Old Brick Gardens. They use fewer hybrid tea roses. They tore out their rose collection, most of their rose collection, to reduce the insecticide spraying. They use more woodies in their garden rather than herbaceous plants because they're lower maintenance, require less water, less fussing. They plant bulbs that naturalize, that return year after year. So if you wanted to plant tulips, you would look for on the package, it'll say species tulips, and those tulips will grow and multiply in your garden. You do not have to replant those tulip bulbs every year. And another technique they do is they've been installing gravel gardens at Old Brick. And let me show you what those are. Jeff calls them a lean and mean system. And so this is what they're made out of: drought tolerant plants, typically prairie plants. They have these tiny little pots that the plants come in. You can see them here. Here's the plant, here's the gravel, and here are the roots. The roots go down in the soil, and the gravel mulches the plants so they're cool underneath. And then I'll show you, they use sidewalk or driveway for a border so that they have like for that, hold that gravel in place. They don't add any other organic matter. They don't add compost or soil or anything. And they water the plants for 2 years. And after that, they don't require a watering pretty much at all. So he recommends you start out small. Let me show you what it looks like. So Jeff first, before he installed these at the garden, in the public garden in Madison, he tried it at his own house. So this is his front yard. This is the second year after he put the plant plugs in. And so here's the curb, what holds the gravel in. And here are all the plants in his front yard. And in the second year, later in July, the gravel has all become covered up with plants, and they are thriving. They're not just surviving in the gravel, they're thriving. So they use a similar technique at the entrance to Old Brick Gardens. You can see it very obviously, and there are several other gardens. They keep installing them all the time, so I'm not up to date on where they've installed them most recently. But you can see the plants are lovely in a gravel garden. Here's another one, another shot. And the only work you might have to do around this is spring cleanup. So what they're doing is they're cutting everything back by hand. So for a large garden, that's a big deal. They don't use mechanics. Mechanics don't work on the gravel. So they bring in a crew and they cut back everything by hand. And if you're wondering about weeds, in the first year, 9 times out of 10, the weeds might land in the crown of the plant. And once you have pulled those out, Jeff says you're in pretty good shape. So that's a gravel garden. So let me hand it back to Laura to see what kinds of questions we have.
Thank you so much. That was just lovely. I'll clap since everybody's off mute. Thanks, Mom. That was just fantastic. So now we have just a little bit of time for everyone. If you want to either in the chat, or I'm going to actually stop